My bank screen read 0. 12 years of savings. Wiped out. The man snoring softly beside me hadn't just drained my accounts. He'd dismantled my entire life to fund his mistress's vanity project. When I confronted him, he laughed. When the truck hit my sedan later that night, I thought my pathetic story was over. I was wrong. I woke up 3 years in the past, smelling his cheap body wash, holding the joint account paperwork. This time, I'm not signing. I'm destroying him. Dying didn't hurt at first. It was mostly noise. The deafening crunch of metal folding in on itself. The shatter of tempered glass spraying across my cheeks like ice. And then the suffocating smell of engine coolant and my own copper blood. I was driving blind, crying so hard, my chest physically ached. Simon had taken it all. $340,000. Gone. Funneled into an LLC registered to a woman named Beatrice, a Pilates instructor who liked to post pictures of her matching his and hers Rolexes on Instagram. When I'd shoved the bank statements into Simon's chest in our kitchen, he hadn't even apologized. He just picked a piece of lint off his sweater. You were suffocating me, Clara. I needed to invest in myself for once. Then came the headlights in the rain, the swerve, the impact, and then a sharp, violent inhale. I jolted upright, my lungs expanding so fast, my ribs cracked with the effort. I was gasping, clawing at my own throat, waiting for the blood, waiting for the crushed steering wheel against my sternum. Nothing. My fingers tangled in cheap, polyblend sheets. The mattress dipped. The steady rhythmic hum of our old window. AC unit vibrated through the floorboards. I blinked, my vision swimming in the dim morning light, filtering through cheap plastic blinds. The smell hit me next. Burnt toast and Old Spice. Simon's signature morning concoction. My heart hammered against my ribs, like a trapped bird. I threw off the covers and stumbled out of bed, my bare feet slapping against the peeling linoleum floor of the hallway. The bathroom mirror was right there. I braced my hands on the porcelain sink, the ceramic cold and grounding against my sweaty palms. I stared at my reflection. There were no glass cuts on my cheeks. My collarbone wasn't shattered. I looked younger. The deep, purple bags of exhaustion that had plagued my last 2 years of marriage were barely shadows. I snatched my phone off the counter. October 14th, 3 years ago, the day I was supposed to transfer my liquid assets into our new joint account to streamline our finances. The day he officially began siphoning my life's work. A wave of nausea hit me so hard, I dry heaved into the sink. It wasn't a magical, triumphant realization. It was terrifying. The world felt thin, like paper, ready to tear at any second. I turned the cold tap on, splashed water on my face, and let it drip down my neck. The freezing temperature was real. The rough texture of the towel was real. "Clara, you good in there?" His voice. It drifted down the hall, slightly muffled by the drywall. 3 minutes ago, in my timeline, that voice was telling me I was a suffocating bore. Now, it was laced with that fake, boyish charm he always used when he wanted my debit card. I walked into the kitchen. Simon was standing by the stove, scraping a blackened piece of bread with a butter knife. He wore his gray sweatpants and a tight white t-shirt. He looked exactly the same, handsome, in a lazy, unearned way. The jawline that had charmed his way through business school, the slightly messy brown hair he spent 20 minutes styling to look unstyled. "Morning, babe," he said, not looking up. "The paperwork is on the counter. We need to get it to the bank by noon, so the transfer clears before the weekend." I looked at the kitchen island. There it was, the blue folder, The document that would ruin me. I didn't feel rage. Rage is hot and loud. What I felt was a sudden, profound drop in temperature in my chest. A cold, absolute vacuum. I stared at the way his mouth hung slightly open as he concentrated on scraping the toast. He breathed through his mouth when he was focused. I used to think it was endearing. Now, I just saw a leech attaching itself to its host for the morning feeding. "I'm not signing it," I said. My voice sounded foreign, flat, raspy, and completely devoid of the usual apologetic cadence I used with him. Simon stopped scraping. He turned around, the butter knife still in his hand. He offered a small, patronizing smile. "What? Did you forget a signature on one of the pages?" "No." I walked over to the island, picking up the blue folder. The paper felt heavy. I'm not doing the joint account. I'm keeping my finances separate. The smile slipped, just a millimeter. The skin around his eyes tightened. "Clara, we talked about this. It makes 0 cents to pay 2 sets of account fees. Plus, my startup needs that capital buffer to show investors I have skin in the game. We're a team. Remember? A team. My money, his skin in the game. Your startup," I said, leaning against the counter, crossing my arms over my chest to hide the slight tremor in my hands, "is an app for finding artisanal dog food. It has no revenue model. You don't need a $300,000 buffer. You need a job." The silence in the kitchen was absolute, save for the mechanical buzz of the refrigerator. Simon stared at me, his eyes narrowing. He set the knife down on the counter with a sharp clack. The facade was cracking faster than I remembered. Usually, it took a few hours of him wheedling and pouting before the nasty side came out. But I had never been this blunt before. I was the supportive wife, the safety net. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Where is this coming from? Are you on your period or something?" There it was, the casual cruelty, wrapped in everyday misogyny. In my past life, I would have flinched. I would have backpedaled, apologized for my tone, and signed the paper just to prove I wasn't being hysterical. I felt a genuine, bubbling laugh rise in my throat, dry and cynical. I let it out. "No, Simon, I'm just awake." I dropped the blue folder into the garbage can under the sink. It landed on top of wet coffee grounds with a soft thud. "Hey!" He lunged forward, grabbing my upper arm. His grip was tight, digging into my bicep. The texture of his warm, slightly sweaty palm sent a jolt of pure revulsion through my system. I didn't try to pull away. I didn't scream. I just looked down at his hand on my arm, and then up into his eyes. "Let go of me," I whispered. It wasn't a request. He blinked, clearly unnerved by my complete lack of panic. He let go, stepping back and holding his hands up defensively. "Jesus, Clara, relax. You're acting crazy. I'm just trying to build a future for us." "You're trying to build a future for yourself," I corrected, walking past him toward our bedroom. I pulled my suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. The zipper caught on the fabric, sticking stubbornly before giving way with a loud tear. I started tossing things in: blazers, blouses, slacks, the uniform of the corporate grind. I worked so he could play entrepreneur in coffee shops all day. Simon hovered in the doorway, his arrogance replaced by confusion. "What are you doing? Are you packing? Over a bank account?" "Clara, stop being so dramatic." "I'm leaving, Simon." I shoved a pair of heels into the side pocket. "I'll have a lawyer contact you by Monday." "A lawyer? For what?" He let out a nervous chuckle. "We're married. You can't just walk out because we had a disagreement about banking. Watch me." I zipped the bag shut. The sound was loud in the small room. I grabbed my laptop bag and my purse. My heart was still racing, but the fear was gone, replaced by a hyper-focused clarity. Every detail of the room seemed sharp. The dust motes floating in the shaft of sunlight, the scuff mark on the baseboard, the faint smell of mildew in the carpet. I was leaving all of this behind. I walked toward the door. He blocked my path, crossing his arms, puffing his chest out to make himself look wider. "You walk out that door, Clara, and we're done. I won't be here when you come crawling back." I stopped inches from him. I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "That," I said softly, "is the best promise you've ever made me." I stepped around him. He didn't grab me again. I think the absolute deadness in my eyes scared him. I walked down the hall, out the front door, and into the crisp October morning. The air outside tasted different. It didn't taste like ozone and blood. It tasted like cold concrete and exhaust fumes. It tasted like freedom. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, just gripping the steering wheel, letting the aftershocks roll through me. My hands shook so badly I couldn't get the key in the ignition. I had done it. The parasite was severed. But I knew Simon. He wouldn't just disappear. He felt entitled to my success. If I left him, he would try to take half in the divorce. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for my bank. "Hi," I said, my voice steadying. "I need to freeze all outward transfers on my accounts immediately. And I'd like to speak to a manager about securing my assets pending a divorce filing." By noon, my money was locked down tight in a trust account my lawyer set up. By 2 p.m., I had a short-term lease on a furnished studio across town. By 5 p.m., I bought a bottle of cheap red wine, sat on an unfamiliar, stiff couch, and watched the city lights flicker to life. I had my money, but surviving wasn't enough. I didn't just want to escape Simon. I wanted to outgrow him so completely that when I finally stepped on him, I wouldn't even notice the crunch. 3 years is a long time when you stop sleeping and start scheming. My rise wasn't glamorous. It was built on cold, black coffee that tasted like battery acid, fluorescent office lights that made my eyes twitch, and the relentless, mechanical process of outworking everyone in my department. When I left Simon, I was a mid-level financial analyst. Now, I sat in the corner office of the 42nd floor, the executive vice president of acquisitions for Mitchell Holdings. The air up here was aggressively filtered, chilled to exactly 68 degrees. My chair was imported leather, rigid and unyielding, keeping my spine perfectly straight. There was no peeling linoleum, only brushed steel and floor-to-ceiling glass that made the city below look like a child's playset. I tapped my gold pen against the mahogany table. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed in the massive, empty boardroom. I was early. I liked being early. It allowed me to control the atmosphere before the prey arrived. My assistant, a sharp young guy named Colin, stepped into the room. "Ms. Hayes," he said, reading from his tablet. "The founders of Auratech are in the lobby. Should I send them in?" "Send the CEO in alone," I said, not looking up from the dossier in front of me. "Let the others wait in the lobby." "Understood." I opened the file. Auratech. It wasn't an artisanal dog food app anymore. Simon had pivoted. He'd spent the last 3 years, and God knows whose money, trying to build a centralized logistics platform for boutique retailers. It was ambitious. It was also bleeding cash at a catastrophic rate. According to my analysts, Auratech was 3 weeks away from missing payroll. They were desperate. They needed a buyout, or at least a massive capital injection, and Mitchell Holdings was known for scooping up distressed tech assets for pennies on the dollar. Simon had no idea I worked here. When we divorced, it was brutal, but fast. I had the paper trail proving the seed money he'd already taken was my pre-marital asset. I buried his lawyer in paperwork until Simon couldn't afford the legal fees and settled for nothing. We hadn't spoken since. He probably thought I was still rotting in a cubicle somewhere, licking my wounds. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked open. I kept my eyes on the dossier, taking a slow sip of my water. The condensation on the glass left a cold ring on my palm. Footsteps, confident, heavy, trying to own the room. Some things never change. "Good morning," Simon's voice rang out, overly loud, coated in that same faux charm. "I'm Simon, CEO of Auratech. I believe I was supposed to meet with the VP of Acquisitions." I let the silence hang for a full 5 seconds. I listened to his breathing. It hitched, just slightly, as the quiet stretched on too long. He shifted his weight. His leather shoes squeaked against the polished hardwood. Slowly, I closed the file. I leaned back in the rigid leather chair and finally lifted my eyes. He was wearing a tailored navy suit that definitely cost more than he could currently afford. His hair was slightly thinner, the lines around his mouth deeper. The stress of impending bankruptcy was eating him alive, even if he tried to hide it behind an expensive tie. When his eyes met mine, his entire body locked up. It was a physical reaction, a full-body flinch. The color drained from his face so fast, I thought he might actually pass out. His jaw slackened. The confident CEO posture collapsed into the terrified slouch of a man who just realized he'd walked into a trap. "Clara," he choked out. The word barely made it past his vocal cord. I rested my forearms on the table, clasping my hands together. I didn't smile. A smile would give him a reaction to work with. I gave him nothing but cold, corporate detachment. "It's Ms. Hayes in this building," I said, my voice smooth, echoing slightly in the large room. "Take a seat, Simon. We have a lot of debt to discuss." He didn't move. He just stared at me, his eyes darting to the glass walls, the expensive art, the title on the folder under my hands. His brain was violently rejecting the reality in front of him. You're the VP?" he stammered, gripping the back of one of the guest chairs, so hard his knuckles went white. "No, that's impossible. Colin said I was meeting with the head of acquisitions." "And you are." I tilted my head. "Sit down. Unless Auratech suddenly found a way to cover the $3.2 million in outstanding vendor liabilities since yesterday." His mouth snapped shut. The reality of his situation crashed over him. He was completely at my mercy. His company, his ego, his entire livelihood was sitting in a file under my right hand. Slowly, agonizingly, Simon pulled the chair out and sat down. He looked small. The massive boardroom swallowed him whole. "Good," I said, opening his file again. The paper crinkled sharply in the quiet room. "Let's talk about why your company is completely worthless." Simon swallowed hard. In the cavernous silence of the boardroom, the click in his throat was audible. He reached up, 2 fingers tugging at the Windsor knot of his tie, trying to loosen a collar that suddenly seemed too tight. The faint, metallic scent of nervous sweat began to seep through his expensive cologne, an acrid undertone ruining the perfectly curated illusion he had walked in with. "Clara," he started, aiming for a soft, intimate register. It was the voice he used to use when he'd overdrawn our checking account to buy courtside tickets and needed me to transfer funds from my savings. A conspiratorial, we're in this together whisper. "Let's just take a breath here. I don't know how you ended up in this chair, but obviously, this is a conflict of interest. We have a history. We have a closed legal settlement, I corrected, keeping my voice flat. I traced the edge of the manila folder with my index finger. The cardstock was stiff and dry, and Mitchell Holdings has a fiduciary duty to its shareholders to evaluate distressed assets. Right now, Auratech is bleeding $300,000 a month, Simon. You aren't a conflict of interest. You're a liability on a balance sheet. His eyes darted around the room again, looking for an exit, a witness, anything to break the suffocating pressure of my gaze. When he found nothing but empty leather chairs and the cold, gray sky pressing against the floor-to-ceiling glass, he leaned forward, planting his elbows on the mahogany table. "You're enjoying this," he spat, dropping the charm. The corners of his mouth tightened into an ugly, petulant line. "You set this up just to humiliate me. You've been tracking me." I felt a sudden, heavy wave of exhaustion wash over me. It wasn't triumph. It was the grim realization of how small he actually was. For years, in my previous life, this man had been the sun I orbited. I had contorted my ambitions, my finances, and my self-worth to fit his gravity. Now, looking at the slight tremor in his hands and the blotchy red patches blooming on his neck, I didn't feel like a mastermind. I felt a dull, echoing pity for the woman I used to be. "I don't care enough about you to track you, Simon," I said, opening the file and flattening the pages with my palm. "You came to us. Your broker submitted the prospectus to my junior analysts on Tuesday. I didn't even know it was your company until the compliance check flagged your name yesterday afternoon." I slid a stapled stack of financial disclosures across the polished wood. They whispered against the grain, coming to a stop an inch from his white knuckles. "Let's look at page 4, shall we?" I didn't wait for him to pick it up. I knew the numbers by heart. Your burn rate accelerated by 40% in Q3. You attribute this to aggressive marketing pushes in secondary markets. But Mitchell Holdings did a preliminary audit of the operating accounts you opened up during due diligence. You aren't buying digital ad space, Simon. You're funneling Series A capital into a shell LLC called BFit Consulting for, quote, wellness and lifestyle branding. Simon flinched as if I had struck him across the face. The blood rushed out of his cheeks, leaving him a sallow, sickly gray. He knew that I knew. BFit Consulting. Beatrice, the Pilates instructor. In my first life, I found out about Beatrice through an errant text message on his unlocked phone. In this life, I found her through SEC filings. He was paying for his mistress's studio rent and designer handbags using his investors' money. He had merely swapped me out for venture capitalists, but the parasitic mechanics were exactly the same. "That is a legitimate contractor expense," Simon stammered, his voice climbing in pitch. "You have no right to question my operational expenditures without a formal term sheet." "It's wire fraud," I said softly. The silence that followed was absolute. The mechanical hum of the HVAC system seemed to roar in my ears. "It's wire fraud, Simon, and your co-founders don't know," I continued, watching his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror. "I read the cap table. You hold 40%. Your CTO, Greg, holds 30%. Your head of sales, Liam, holds 20%. I guarantee you didn't ask for board approval to write $50,000 monthly retainers to your girlfriend. If the bridge loan you took out last month defaults, and it will on the 15th, the creditors are going to pierce the corporate veil. They are going to audit everything. And when they find Beatrice, you aren't just going to bankruptcy court. You're going to federal prison." He sat frozen, The bravado had completely evaporated. He looked like a deflated balloon, his expensive suit suddenly hanging loosely on his frame. The fabric of his trousers rustled as his leg began to bounce uncontrollably under the table. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice cracking. He looked down at his hands, unwilling to meet my eyes. "You want me to beg? Is that it? You want an apology for 3 years ago?" "I don't want your apologies," I said, closing the folder and folding my hands on top of it. "Your apologies are worthless, Simon. I want your company." I pressed the silver intercom button set into the mahogany table. The metal was cold beneath my thumb. "Colin," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the crown of Simon's bowed head, "please send the other 2 gentlemen from Oratech in." Simon's head snapped up, a look of sheer panic twisting his features. "No. Clara, wait. You can't. Let me talk to them first. Let me explain the BFIT expenditures. If you tell them, they'll vote to oust me before we even sign a term sheet." "They are officers of the company," I replied, leaning back in my chair. The stiff leather groaned slightly. "They have a right to be present for an acquisition offer." The heavy oak doors clicked and swung open. Greg and Liam walked in. I recognized them from their LinkedIn profiles, though they looked much more haggard in person. Greg, the CTO, was a brilliant but socially awkward engineer, with terrible posture and dark circles under his eyes. Liam, the sales lead, was all restless energy, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders. They stepped into the massive boardroom, intimidated by the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding them. Then they looked at Simon. They saw his ashen face, the sweat gleaming on his forehead, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table as if it were a life raft. "Simon?" Greg asked, his brow furrowing. "Is everything okay? What's going on?" "Gentlemen, please, take a seat," I said, gesturing to the chairs opposite me. "I am Ms. Mitchell, Executive Vice President of Acquisitions here. I'll be handling the evaluation of Oratech." They sat down, casting nervous, sideways glances at their CEO. Simon didn't look at them. He stared straight ahead at my throat. His jaw clenched so tight, the muscles twitched. I handed a thick, bound document to each of them, sliding them across the table. "Let me be incredibly blunt, to save us all time," I started, folding my hands in my lap. "Mitchell Holdings is prepared to offer a buyout of Oratech. However, the valuation presented by your broker is a fantasy. Your tech stack is impressive, Greg, and we want the IP, but your balance sheet is a disaster. You are heavily leveraged, facing immediate default on 3 separate bridge loans, and your primary operating account has been severely compromised by gross financial mismanagement." "Mismanagement?" Liam interjected, leaning forward, his defensive instincts kicking in. "We've had high customer acquisition costs, sure, but we're building market share. You've been paying $50,000 a month to a Pilates instructor in Chelsea." I cut him off, my voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. Liam froze. Greg blinked, his eyes darting from me to Simon. "What?" "Page 12 of the audit summary in front of you," I said gently. "Your CEO has been funneling Series A capital into a shell entity. I assume neither of you signed off on this?" The temperature in the room plummeted. I watched the realization dawn on Greg's face, followed instantly by a wave of furious, suffocating betrayal. He turned to Simon. "BFIT Consulting. That invoice you forced me to clear last month. You said it was for outsourced UI/UX testing." Simon opened his mouth, a pathetic, wet sound escaping his lips, but no words formed. He couldn't spin this. The paper trail was printed in black and white, right in front of them. "He's broke you," I said to Greg and Liam, softening my tone just a fraction to separate them from the parasite sitting between them. "Mitchell Holdings will acquire the company. We will assume all outstanding corporate debt. We will clear the vendor liabilities so your personal credit isn't ruined when this ship sinks, and we will offer you both." I looked pointedly at Greg and Liam. "Retention contracts at standard market rates to integrate your logistics platform into our existing retail infrastructure." Liam looked down at the term sheet, his hands shaking slightly. "And the equity? The buyout price for our shares?" "0, I said. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "We are buying a distressed asset to harvest its parts," I explained, clinically. "You get out without declaring personal bankruptcy, and you get a stable paycheck. That is the offer." I turned my gaze slowly back to Simon. "As for your CEO, Mitchell Holdings has no use for his services. He will surrender his 40% equity, resign immediately, and walk away with nothing. Or we walk away, and you default next Friday." Simon exploded. He didn't just stand up. He launched himself out of the chair, slamming his palms onto the mahogany table so hard the water glasses rattled. "You absolute bitch!" he screamed, the veins in his neck bulging. Spittle flew from his lips. The mask was completely gone, leaving only the violent, entitled narcissist I used to make excuses for. "This is a vendetta. You're trying to ruin me over a stupid bank account 3 years ago." Greg and Liam recoiled, pressing themselves back into their chairs, horrified by the sudden outburst. "Security!" Colin's voice crackled instantly from the intercom on the table. "Do you need assistance, Miss Mitchell?" "Not yet, Colin," I said calmly, not breaking eye contact with Simon. I didn't flinch. My heart wasn't even racing. I felt entirely grounded, feeling the solid floor beneath my heels and the rigid support of my chair. I looked at the man screaming at me and saw nothing but a dying insect thrashing on its back. "Sign the term sheet, Simon," I whispered, the quietness of my voice forcing him to stop screaming just to hear me. "Or I call the SEC compliance hotline right now and forward them the BFIT invoices. You have 3 minutes." The ink on the term sheet was a harsh, vibrant blue. Simon's signature was practically a violent slash across the dotted line, tearing a small hole in the heavy parchment paper. He hadn't spoken another word. He just signed it, threw the pen onto the table, and stormed out of the boardroom without looking at Greg or Liam. The actual acquisition process would take weeks of legal maneuvering, but the blood was on the wall. He was out. He had nothing. No company, no equity. And because of the ironclad non-disparagement and non-compete clauses my lawyers buried in the exit paperwork, no future in the logistics sector. An hour later, I stepped out of the Mitchell Holdings tower into the biting November wind. The sky was an unforgiving slate gray. I pulled the collar of my wool coat up against the chill, the rough texture scratching comfortably against my jaw. I felt light, almost dangerously light, as if a physical weight had been surgically extracted from my chest. I walked 2 blocks to a high-end espresso bar I frequented, craving the bitter, grounding taste of a dark roast. The bell above the door chimed, a bright, cheerful sound that clashed violently with my mood. The cafe smelled of roasted beans, steamed milk, and expensive, cloying vanilla perfume. I paused near the pastry case. The perfume was overwhelming. I knew that scent. Clara. I turned slowly. Sitting at a small marble table in the corner was Simon. His tie was stuffed into his coat pocket, his top button undone, and sitting next to him, gripping a matcha latte with a perfectly manicured hand, was Beatrice. She was exactly as she looked on her Instagram in my past life, effortlessly beautiful, with long, glossy blonde hair and skin that looked like it had never known fluorescent office lighting. She was wearing a white cashmere sweater that cost more than my first car, and resting on the chair beside her was a quilted Chanel bag, paid for by Oratech, paid for by the company I just liquidated. Simon stared at me, his eyes bloodshot and chaotic. He was running entirely on the fumes of his shattered ego. He had dragged her here, waiting for me, desperately trying to construct a scenario where he still held some kind of emotional high ground. "I wanted you to meet her in person," Simon said, his voice dripping with a toxic, artificial sweetness. He reached out and placed his hand over Beatrice's. She looked confused, giving me a polite, hesitant smile. "This is Beatrice, the woman I'm building a real life with. You might have taken the company, Clara, but you can't take this. I'm walking away with the only thing that actually matters." He was trying to hurt me. He was parading the mistress, the catalyst of my past ruin, expecting me to break down in jealous tears in the middle of a coffee shop. He thought I was the same terrified, insecure wife from 3 years ago who begged him to love her. I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, bottomless sense of secondhand embarrassment. "Hi, Clara," Beatrice said, her voice soft and slightly breathless. "Simon told me you guys used to be married. He said you were being really difficult about his business transition today." His business transition? I looked at Beatrice. Really looked at her. In my previous life, I hated her. She was the ghost haunting my marriage, the black hole consuming my life savings. But standing here now, hearing the naive, trusting lilt in her voice, I realized she was just a prop to him, another resource to be drained. She had no idea who she was sitting next to. "A business transition," I repeated, my voice even, devoid of any malice. "Is that what he told you?" Simon's grip on her hand tightened. I saw her wince slightly, pulling her fingers back a fraction. "Don't, Clara," he hissed, the facade cracking instantly. "Just walk away. You got your pound of flesh." I stepped closer to the marble table. The hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter suddenly seemed very loud. I looked down at the Chanel bag on the chair. "Beatrice," I said calmly, ignoring Simon completely. "Has Simon mentioned where the funding for BFIT Consulting is going to come from next month?" Her brow furrowed in confusion. "What? No. Simon handles all my studio's back-end financing through his venture capital network. We just expanded our lease." I let out a slow, quiet breath. The tragedy of it was almost poetic. "Simon doesn't have a venture capital network anymore, Beatrice," I said, keeping my tone gentle, almost conversational. "He doesn't have a company. He just signed away all of his equity an hour ago to avoid federal prosecution for embezzlement." "Shut up!" Simon slammed his free hand against the table. Several patrons turned to look at us, their eyes wide. Beatrice shrank back in her chair, staring at Simon with sudden, dawning horror. "Simon, what is she talking about? What embezzlement? He used his investors' capital to pay your studio rent and buy that bag," I continued, pointing a gloved finger at the quilted leather. "The company is being liquidated. The creditors are going to audit the books. They will see the fraudulent invoices. They are going to freeze his accounts. And then, Beatrice, they are going to come for yours, because you are technically the recipient of stolen funds." The color drained from Beatrice's perfectly flushed cheeks. She looked at Simon, searching his face for a denial, a laugh, a reassurance that the crazy ex-wife was just making things up. But Simon couldn't look at her. He was staring at the marble tabletop, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cornered desperation. The silence confirmed everything. "You," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. "You told me the studio was secure. You told me the investors loved the wellness pivot. Baby, listen, I can fix this." Simon started, reaching for her hand again. She snatched it away as if he had burned her. The texture of her cashmere sweater scraped against the table edge as she pushed her chair back violently. The metal legs screeched against the tile floor. "Don't touch me," she breathed, her eyes welling with panicked tears. She grabbed her phone from the table, leaving the Chanel bag sitting on the chair. It was tainted now. She knew it. "I have to call my lawyer." "Oh my God, you lied to me. You used my business to steal money?" "Beatrice, wait!" Simon stood up, knocking his own chair over with a loud clatter. She didn't wait. She practically sprinted for the door, the bell chiming happily as she bolted out onto the gray sidewalk, disappearing into the pedestrian traffic. Simon stood there, in the middle of the quiet cafe, surrounded by staring strangers, the overturned chair at his feet. He was entirely, fundamentally alone. The illusion was shattered. The parasite had killed its host, and now it had nowhere left to feed. He slowly turned to look at me. There was no rage left in his eyes, only a hollow, echoing terror, the realization that the consequences of his actions had finally, inescapably, caught up with him. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the pathetic slump of his shoulders and the tremor in his jaw. Then, I turned around, walked up to the counter, and ordered my dark roast to go. I paid in cash, left a generous tip, and walked out the door without looking back. Returning to the office after the coffee shop felt like stepping into a vacuum. The temperature in the Mitchell Holdings lobby was heavily regulated, the air scrubbed of any city grit, smelling faintly of lemon polish and expensive marble. I swiped my keycard at the turnstile. The mechanical beep and the heavy thud of the locking mechanism clicking open grounded me. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor in total silence. The mirrors lining the cab reflected a woman who looked exactly the same as she had 2 hours ago. My lipstick wasn't smudged. My posture was straight. There was no cinematic swelling of music, no sudden burst of triumphant sunlight breaking through the November clouds outside. There was just the low, humming vibration of the elevator car ascending at 1,000 feet per minute. I won. The parasite was dead. But my chest didn't feel full of victory. It felt hollowed out, scraped clean with a sharp spoon. "Ms. Mitchell," Colin greeted me the second the elevator doors parted. He was holding a stack of beige legal folders, his tablet tucked under his arm. "Legal has drafted the preliminary transfer agreements for the Aura Tech IP. We've also locked Simon out of the primary administrative servers, per standard acquisition protocol." "Good," I said, unbuttoning my coat. The heavy wool slipped off my shoulders. "Get me the lead forensic accountant. I want a full audit team on Auratech's books by 8 a.m. tomorrow. We need to quantify exactly how much capital was diverted before the creditors file their motions." For the next 3 weeks, my life became a masterclass in corporate autopsy. We didn't just fire Simon. We dismantled his entire professional existence, pixel by pixel. When you buy a distressed asset, you aren't just buying technology. You are inheriting every lie the previous owner ever told. Our forensic accounting team set up a war room on the 39th floor. It smelled constantly of stale breath, dry erase markers, and the ozone tang of overheated server racks. I spent hours sitting in that windowless room with David, our lead auditor. David was a quiet man in his 50s who wore reading glasses pushed halfway down his nose and possessed a terrifying ability to spot inconsistencies in spreadsheets. "Look at this," David said, one rainy Tuesday evening, tapping a blunt fingernail against his monitor. The blue light cast deep shadows under his eyes. He was double invoicing. He'd submit an expense report for server maintenance through a vendor in Delaware, but the routing number for the vendor's bank account matches the routing number for a personal checking account he opened in the Cayman Islands. I leaned over his shoulder. The screen was a wall of tiny, meaningless numbers to anyone else. To me, it was a map of Simon's arrogance. "How much?" I asked. My voice was dry. The air in the room was terribly devoid of humidity, making my throat itch constantly. Over the last 14 months, David clicked a few keys, highlighting a column in bright, aggressive yellow. $420,000. He wasn't just funding his girlfriend's Pilates studio. He was squirreling away an exit fund. He knew the company was going to fail. I stared at the yellow column. The sheer, banal audacity of it made a cold lump form in my stomach. 3 years ago, he drained my life savings of $340,000. Now, he had stolen almost $500,000 from people who trusted him to build something real. He hadn't changed. He hadn't learned. He had just found a larger host. "Document it all," I told David, stepping back from the desk. The carpet under my heels felt thin and synthetic. "Package the offshore routing data with the BFIT invoices. When the SEC requests the preliminary disclosures, I want a bow tied around it. The real tragedy of Simon wasn't that he was evil. It was that he was incredibly, painfully ordinary. His fraud wasn't a brilliant mastermind scheme. It was sloppy. It was desperate. It was the financial equivalent of a child stealing cookies and leaving a trail of crumbs leading directly to his bedroom. As the weeks dragged on, the human cost of his incompetence began to surface. Greg and Liam, the co-founders, spent most of their time in our integration labs, looking shell-shocked. They had spent 3 years working 80-hour weeks, missing their kids' birthdays, burning their own health to the ground to build the logistics algorithm that Simon was using as a shiny object to distract investors. One afternoon, I found Greg sitting in the employee cafeteria. He was staring blindly at a plastic container of lukewarm soup. His posture was terrible, his shoulders hunched up by his ears. "The integration is progressing ahead of schedule," I said, pulling out the chair across from him. The plastic legs scraped loudly against the tile. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his eyes were bloodshot. "We lost our health insurance, Clara," he said quietly. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. "When Simon defaulted on the final bridge loan before the acquisition went through, the carrier dropped us. My daughter needs insulin. I had to pay out of pocket yesterday. It cost me $800. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the small table. I looked at the congealing grease on the surface of his soup. "HR will backdate your Mitchell Holdings benefits to the 1st of the month," I told him, keeping my voice steady, strictly professional, to hide the spike of absolute rage flaring in my chest. "Submit the pharmacy receipt to Colin. It will be reimbursed by Friday." Greg nodded slowly, a single tear escaping and tracking down his unwashed cheek. He wiped it away angrily with the back of his hand. He was my best friend in college. He was the best man at my wedding. "I know," I said softly. And I did. I knew exactly what it felt like to look at the person you trusted most in the world and realize you were staring at a hollow shell. I left the cafeteria and walked back to my office. The rage in my chest wasn't hot. It was a cold, absolute zero. I didn't just want Simon to lose his company anymore. I wanted the justice system to grind him down to fine dust. I wanted every ounce of his unearned privilege stripped away and laid bare under fluorescent lights. The machinery of legal justice does not move with the dramatic flair of a television show. It moves like a glacier, slow, freezing, and capable of crushing everything in its path with millions of tons of pressure. 6 months after the acquisition, the Securities and Exchange Commission, spurred by the packaged evidence Mitchell Holdings submitted during the corporate bankruptcy proceedings, formally charged Simon with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. Because we were the acquiring entity that uncovered the fraud, I was subpoenaed as a corporate witness for the initial depositions. The law firm handling the creditor lawsuit was located in a brutalist concrete building downtown. The conference room where the deposition took place was aggressively sterile. The walls were painted a shade of beige that seemed designed to sap the will to live. The only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic, terrifyingly fast click-clack of the court reporter's steno machine. I sat at one end of a long, scratched veneer table. My corporate counsel sat to my right, tapping a silver pen rhythmically against a legal pad. Simon sat at the opposite end. I barely recognized him. The 6 months had aged him a decade. The custom-tailored suits were gone, replaced by an off-the-rack gray jacket that hung loosely off his shoulders. He had lost at least 20 pounds. The arrogant, boyish fullness of his face had evaporated, leaving behind sharp, sunken cheekbones and a grayish pallor. His hair was thinning rapidly, unstyled and flat against his scalp. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He kept his eyes fixed on the plastic water pitcher in the center of the table. Ms. Mitchell, the lead prosecutor, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense bob, began. Can you verify that this document, Exhibit C, was recovered from the administrative servers of Auratech on the day Mitchell Holdings assumed control of the assets? Yes, I replied, my voice steady. The court reporter's machine clicked furiously. That is the internal ledger tracking Series A disbursements. And can you explain what line item 402 represents? It represents a wire transfer of $50,000 to an entity named BFit Consulting, categorized under outsourced development. Did Mitchell Holdings find any evidence that BFit Consulting provided software development services to Auratech? No. Our forensic audit confirmed BFit Consulting is a registered LLC operating a fitness studio in Chelsea. There was no software development. Every word I spoke felt like a physical weight dropping onto Simon's shoulders. He shrank into his chair. His lawyer, a public defender who looked entirely overworked and deeply uninterested in saving a white-collar criminal, occasionally objected to the phrasing of a question. But the objections were half-hearted. They had no defense. The paper trail was absolute. We sat in that suffocating, beige room for 4 hours. The prosecutor walked methodically through every stolen dollar, every fake invoice, every offshore transfer. It was a tedious, mind-numbing dissection of Simon's character. The smell of the room, stale coffee, nervous sweat, and the sharp tang of printer ink seeped into my clothes. I focused on the texture of the mahogany table, tracing the artificial wood grain with my thumbnail. I felt a strange sense of detachment. The man sitting across from me wasn't the monster who had drained my accounts 3 years ago. He wasn't the slick CEO who had swaggered into my boardroom. He was just a pathetic, broken data point on a spreadsheet. Finally, the prosecutor turned her attention to the bridge loans. "Simon," she said, addressing him directly for the first time in an hour, "did you inform your co-founders or your creditors that you had used the remaining liquid capital to lease a luxury vehicle under the company's name 2 days before defaulting?" Simon stared at the table. His hands were trembling so badly he had to interlock his fingers and press them against his stomach. His voice was a dry, ragged whisper. He cleared his throat, the sound wet and pathetic. "I believed the marketing push would generate the revenue needed to cover the loan. The car it was for client retention. Optics, the prosecutor repeated, her tone dripping with absolute disgust. "You bought a $120,000 sports car for optics, while your employees' health insurance premiums bounced?" Simon squeezed his eyes shut. A single, pathetic sob tore its way out of his throat. It wasn't a dignified cry. It was the ugly, wet sound of a man who realized there were no more corners to back into, no more lies to spin. "I was trying to save it," he wept, his face buried in his hands. "You don't understand the pressure. I was just trying to keep the lights on. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." I looked at him. The man crying across the table was the same man who had laughed when he told me I was suffocating him. He was the same man who had confidently signed a fake invoice to fund his mistress. His tears weren't born of remorse. They were born of self-pity. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was only sorry he was sitting in this room. I felt a sudden, desperate need to breathe real air. The detachment fractured, replaced by a suffocating claustrophobia. I didn't want to be here anymore. I didn't want to look at him. The revenge I had meticulously planned, the justice I had sought, suddenly felt like drinking salt water. It was technically doing the job, but it was leaving me profoundly nauseous. "Counselor," I interrupted, my voice cutting sharply through the sound of Simon's weeping. The prosecutor looked up, surprised. "Yes, Ms. Mitchell, the corporate entity of Mitchell Holdings has submitted all requested documentation. The forensic audit speaks for itself. Are my direct testimonies regarding the financial ledgers concluded for today?" The prosecutor looked at her notes, then at Simon, then back at me. She understood. There was nothing more to extract here but humiliation, and I was done participating in it. "Yes, Miss Mitchell, we have what we need for the record." "Thank you." I stood up. The scraping of my chair was loud in the quiet room. I didn't look at Simon. I didn't offer a parting glance of triumph. I picked up my briefcase, the leather handle smooth and worn against my palm, and walked out the door. As I walked down the long, carpeted hallway of the law firm, the sounds of the steno machine faded away. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the lobby and out onto the street. The November cold had given way to an early spring. The air outside smelled of wet pavement and the faint, sweet scent of blooming Bradford pears. I stood on the sidewalk, breathing deeply, letting the freezing city wind bite into my cheeks. I closed my eyes and listened to the rush of traffic, the blare of a taxi horn, the distant siren of an ambulance. It was loud. It was chaotic. It was real. I had spent 3 years living in a hyper-focused state of past trauma, trying to right a wrong that had already killed me once. I had rebuilt my life entirely around the architecture of his destruction. But standing on the street corner, feeling the sun warm the top of my head, I realized the absolute truth of it. Destroying him hadn't fixed me. It had only cleared the debris. Now, For the first time in 3 years, I actually had to figure out how to live. It took another 9 months for the hammer to finally fall. White-collar criminal cases drag on endlessly, bogged down by discovery motions and plea negotiations. I didn't follow the trial closely. I instructed Colin to route any legal updates directly to our compliance department and filter them out of my inbox. I was busy. Mitchell Holdings had integrated the Auratech logistics algorithm into our retail infrastructure, saving the firm nearly $20 million in supply chain inefficiencies in the first 2 quarters. I was promoted to Senior Executive Vice President. I bought a penthouse with a view of the river. I learned how to sleep through the night without waking up, gasping for air. Then, on a Tuesday in late October, exactly 4 years since the day I woke up to the smell of burnt toast and Old Spice, Colin walked into my office. "Ms. Mitchell," he said gently, hovering in the doorway. He knew I didn't like talking about the case. Legal just forwarded the final docket. Simon took a plea deal this morning to avoid a jury trial. I stopped typing. The mechanical clicks of my keyboard echoed briefly in the large, quiet office. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window. The leaves in the park below were turning brilliant shades of copper and gold. "And," I asked, keeping my voice neutral, 48 months in federal lockup. Restitution of $2.2 million to the creditors. A lifetime ban from serving as an officer or director of a publicly traded company. Colin read from his tablet. He surrenders on Friday. 4 years. In a low-security federal prison, sure. But he would emerge in his late 30s with a felony record, bankrupt, and carrying a multi-million-dollar restitution judgment that would garnish his wages for the rest of his natural life. He was fundamentally, irrevocably ruined. "Thank you, Colin," I said softly. "That will be all." He nodded and closed the door behind him. I sat alone in the corner office. I waited for the surge of triumph. I waited for the vindication. But all I felt was the smooth texture of my mahogany desk under my fingertips and the soft hum of the city below. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened my personal banking app. I bypassed the Mitchell Holdings equity accounts and the executive trust funds. I scrolled down to my primary checking account. The balance was a comfortable, healthy number. But it wasn't the money that caught my attention. It was the fact that the account was solely in my name, Clara Mitchell. I locked the phone and put it face down on the desk. That evening, I didn't order takeout to my penthouse. I put on a pair of comfortable jeans, a heavy cashmere sweater, and a worn-in leather jacket. I took the elevator down to the garage and got into my car, a safe, heavy, all-wheel drive sedan. I drove aimlessly for an hour, letting the rhythm of the city wash over me. The streetlights strobed through the cabin, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the dashboard. The leather steering wheel felt solid and grounding in my hands. I remembered the terrifying lack of control. I felt the night the truck hit me, the screech of tires, the shattered glass. I pulled up to a red light in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. The rain had started to fall, a light, misty drizzle that smeared the neon signs of the corner stores into impressionistic blurs of red and blue. The windshield wipers beat a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. I looked out the passenger window. There, standing under the awning of a closed laundromat, smoking a cigarette, was a man. He was wearing a cheap, thin windbreaker that offered no protection against the October chill. His shoulders were hunched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He took a drag of the cigarette, the cherry glowing fiercely in the gloom, illuminating his face for a fraction of a second. It was Simon. I froze. My foot pressed instinctively harder on the brake pedal. He looked terrible. The plea deal had finalized today, which meant he was spending his last 3 days of freedom, standing outside in the rain, smoking a cheap cigarette, entirely alone. The bravado, the suits, the startup, Beatrice, it was all gone. He was nothing but a ghost haunting his own life, waiting for the prison transport to take him away. He turned his head and looked toward the street. His eyes swept over my car. My heart kicked against my ribs. I held my breath, waiting for the shock of recognition, waiting for him to lunge toward the vehicle or shout my name. But his gaze just slid right over me. In the dim light, behind the rain-streaked glass of an ordinary sedan, I was invisible to him. I was just another anonymous driver in a city of millions, waiting for the light to turn green. He didn't recognize the car. He didn't recognize me. He took another drag of his cigarette, flicked the ash onto the wet concrete, and looked away, staring blankly at a pothole filling with dirty rainwater. I realized, with a sudden, profound clarity, that he hadn't thought about me in months. He was consumed entirely by his own misery, his own victimhood. I had spent 4 years defining myself by my victory over him, and he didn't even know I was the architect of his final destruction. He thought he was ruined by the SEC, by bad luck, by creditors. He didn't matter. He had never truly mattered. He was just a pothole I had tripped over in my first life. The traffic light above the intersection turned green. The bright emerald reflection washed over the wet hood of my car. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't honk the horn. I didn't need to see his face register the shock of my presence. I didn't need his fear or his apologies. I had something infinitely more valuable. I had my life. I eased my foot off the brake and pressed the accelerator. The engine hummed with quiet, reliable power. The tires gripped the wet asphalt, pulling me forward, away from the laundromat, away from the ghost in the windbreaker, and into the dark, rain-swept streets of the city. I didn't look in the rearview mirror as I drove away. There was nothing back there worth looking at anymore. That is the end of Clara's story. But the journey of rebuilding never truly stops. If this tale of corporate justice, calculated revenge, and absolute survival resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel right now. We bring you raw, grounded stories of rebirth and taking back control every single week. Drop a comment below and let us know what your first move would be if you woke up in Clara's shoes today. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Thank you for watching our content.